Good morning, everyone. My name is Mariann Carter, and I am humbled and delighted to be able to join all of you today. And I want to give a huge thank you to Able South Carolina Beginnings, our wonderful interpreters, and my fellow panelists and presenters. I am a teacher of the deaf by trade, and I'm also a trained administrator and an educational certified interpreter through the EIPA. I have a huge passion for deaf and hard of hearing children, and I always believe that my number one credential is that I am a CODA, meaning that I am a child of two deaf adults. That experience in my life has led me to this path and certainly gives me a lot of background knowledge of being around a variety of deaf adults. I just want to share with you that as looming as the fall comes and districts are deciding what they're going to do, I hope the topic of teaching deaf and hard of hearing students virtually is helpful for you today. We don't know everything, but the one thing we can do on the immediate is have a good attitude about what's coming next. So I have this slide that says, welcome students, because myself, along with the rest of you, are all students today on this topic. As a quick question, I was just hoping to see maybe who my audience is, because I want to make sure that when I touch on each slide, I know if we have VR counselors, parents, teachers of the deaf on with us, either on Facebook Live or on Zoom. So I really would love to see some comments, and I'm sure I'll get some great feedback. I don't have Facebook Live in front of me, but I'm sure I will be told who's all out there. And if you share who you are or what your role is in a child's life who's deaf and hard of hearing, if you can also share with me if there's anything specific that you're hoping to learn. And at any time during my presentation, if you have questions or have something you want to share, don't hold back. I'm okay for this to be interactive because it certainly will be helpful for everyone. Ooh, we're changing it up. Hold on a second. I see we're changing the screen, so I apologize. I just want to make sure we get back to the presentation mode. There we go. All right. And in the chat, I see that we have a teacher of the deaf. Wonderful, so glad. An audiologist. Oh, I'm thrilled because we can talk about that today. Some parents. And I am delighted that you're here because I'm sure you're having to make some decisions for fall if you haven't already. All right, well, I am so delighted that everybody's here, and thank you for sharing your background with me because that will help me curtail my presentation. So. All righty. This fall, we're going to have a variety of types of learning options, and some districts have a variety and some districts only have one or two. And that means that one size is not going to fit all. And the very simple way of me showing you this is that there's no way we can compare a triangle to a square or square to a circle, but they're all shapes, which means they're all ways of learning, right? Each of the items that we're being offered for our kids primarily is a way for us to learn. It's important that we think about the needs for our children in a couple of different ways. One, the most important thing for parents and audiologists and teachers to think about is what are the new accommodations and services that need to be considered. In my mind, those are the two primary areas on an IEP that will need to be discussed and thought about when you change the environment. There's also some specific needs that need to be considered, such as services and support. And the reason for that is that in a virtual environment, there's not as much similar opportunity for communication. And communication is a huge factor for our children who are deaf and hard of hearing. Exposure to vocabulary and being able to see how peers talk about things as differently than their teachers might talk about things. And so all of those pieces are extremely, extremely important. So we need to make sure that we're paying attention to those things. I just want to make sure that when you think about that, how are you going to, or how is the IEP team going to really consider additional language support or additional opportunities to discuss the items that they're being asked to do on a virtual platform? And then it's also important as a parent that you really evaluate, and I call this knowing yourself and knowing your child. Some kids really struggle with virtual learning, and that is because the demand and the prerequisite skills for that can be very complicated, which means that they primarily rely on video, print, and real time, but there's not the same amount of discussion and freedom that there is in a typical classroom. And understand that not all of our kids are going back to a typical classroom either. So it's not that one is better than another, but these are all factors we need to consider. So in taking that attitude moving forward, I just want to share with you that perhaps the idea is to take your skills and your child's skills and figure out exactly what meets your needs. Ultimately, the purpose here is to create equity, not equality. The reason the goal here is equity is because our kids need equal access to their environment, and it may look different. That is needed. As an example, you are finding that children who maybe are deaf and hard of hearing and the classroom is requiring a Google Meets platform, they might need 2 laptops and not 1. Melinda, I'm noticing in the chat that they'd like you to unmute your mic. Oh, thank you. All right. So what's important here is understanding that you should feel confident to ask for what is needed, and that is an appropriate request. Many times they'll say, well, we're offering this to all of our students, which is very wonderful and helpful, but it doesn't necessarily give us the same view or the same access to what's around us. So I ask you to keep this image in your mind just to make sure that you're not forgetting what's really important. At all times when you're looking at a situation, think about what will give your child the same opportunity, not just that they received the same thing. All right, now we're getting into the nitty gritty. And for the teacher of the deaf and the audiologist, I'm going to try to highlight specific items for you as we walk through this together. So accessibility is something that could even be considered for a 504 plan. It doesn't require that your child has an IEP. So I do want to just highlight that because some parents may have questions about that. And so I am going to cover some of that. The first thing is very important, which is accessibility. Like I gave an example earlier, it may be that your child needs multiple screens to access their learning. It may be that when they're in Zoom class, everyone needs to remember to be muted and take turns and use the chat feature. Another big important piece of accessibility, which we may not think about, is lighting. Some of our teachers don't have great lighting, and so that's very difficult when we are on screen. That also goes for our interpreters and facilitators that are working with students. You want to make sure that you use closed captioning tips. Depending on how your district is handling that, many times it's live. And so that means that only one person can be talking at a time, which means that accommodations like refer to the speaker, their name, and that information before you actually move forward. So the person who's moderating or teaching the class would need to say, Jenny highlighted, and talk about what they said. The other thing is you need to also consider what kind of classes are they taking and what kind of things might they be doing. For example, I have seen many times on math classes that they're showing the problem and they're not necessarily showing themselves. So when they're talking and expecting them to look at something. Another accessibility or accommodation would need to be that you don't talk, you show and then talk, but you can't show and talk at the same time. Some of the tools for learning, and this is important because a lot of our kids when they're in school have a variety of adults and peers that help keep them organized in a live setting. And so when we have to be on a virtual setting or a hybrid setting, we know that that's going to get a little more challenging, especially because a lot of our kids have multiple teachers or services that require them to perform or do certain tasks. So there are some supports for that, like the Google Assignment Tracker, and that is already there on Google Classroom, and you can pull that up. It's an Excel pre-made item where people can all go into that and help keep track of what's due when, so the team can really work together. Some things I would encourage parents to consider is, try to create a schedule for your child. It might be that it needs to be a visual schedule. It might be that it needs to be a written out schedule. Maybe it needs to be planned by them. But it's important that they track their learning. What did they accomplish that was a good grade? What do they need to revisit and check their work? There's also some great apps like PhotoMath or Extra Math and some ASL apps. And don't worry, I have all of this on the next screen for you guys to see. And then I talk about something called container building. And that may be an odd term, but I borrow that term from Brene Brown, who talks about container building. And that means that we're walking into a new environment. It's like we're being put into a new container. And we have to figure out how that's going to work. Now more than ever, communication regularly with our team is important. Setting expectations with our child or student and ourselves is important. As parents and teachers, we have to model what is expected. And we need to come up with regular times to check in with each other. There's going to be a lot of, container building is a lot of trial and error. And the reason this is important is because there's going to be things that we think in our mind or we plan in our mind that we think will make the class accessible, assignments more seamless, understanding and language more in depth. And we might find that there is a block. And when that happens, being consistent about talking with one another, checking on how assignments are being completed, being open enough and having a relationship that's big enough to say, we're struggling here, is super, super important. And I also will share with you for all three of these areas that asking the hard questions is going to be the most important task that you have as a parent, as an audiologist, or as a teacher of the deaf. As a teacher of the deaf, the example of a hard question would be to ask the general ed teachers, how are we going to set up the interpreter for your class? I have some ideas. Also ask, how are we going to manage interpreting if we're using real-time captioning features? An audiologist might ask the question, how is my child hearing and learning through the computer? Are they in a quiet environment at home? Do they really need their FM or DM system? Here's a tough one for some parents. Do I feel confident to check and evaluate my child's FM and DM system at home? Here's where I really ask team members to be honest and ask for help from each other and find a place to be vulnerable with each other, is really investigating how well we communicate with our children. Many times we have vocabulary that's referred to as tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 vocabulary. Tier 1 is really like our everyday conversation. Tier 2 might be more related to the environment or the situation that we're in. That usually gives our kids clues as to what we're talking about or the topic, or what words we might use. Tier 3 is very content specific and it's in depth, and it requires us to think of a specific word and be able to mitigate what that word means in our own words. It's important for us to work together to help build those areas of vocabulary. And I would definitely ask the parents to say, hey, I've got really good capacity with tier 1 and 2, but I really need help with tier 3. So those are some things that I would suggest that you be comfortable with, because that's going to be an area of container building, especially in a virtual model. So I wanted to show you some simple accessibility examples. And these are actually not anything that I've created. I've given credit to the people that have created them down here right on the screen. But I'm going to tell you the things that I like about it. So as an example, this is under the category of accessibility. We'll see that we have a virtual learning matrix. This might be something that's more on target for our middle and high school kids. However, it also gives great examples of what each thing means. So we can talk about what it looks like and what it means. So with the SOAR virtual learning matrix, it has separate items like self-control, being on task, achievement, and respect. And I'll give you just a few simple examples. Under self-control, it says to minimize distractions. That is a certainly wonderful thing to review with your children and the environment that they're learning in at home, so that they can be on top of what they need to be on top of, which is the learning that's happening in front of them. As another example, being on task means that you're logging in and on time, present and actively engaged. This means that our kids need a word, they might need a bank of items that they can access to participate in chat, or come with specific questions ready before class starts. Achievement means to stay on top of your assignments. You might use the assignment tracker that I talked about. What does be prepared really look like? What do our kids need to have in front of them? Or more importantly, can they navigate multiple things on a screen? And this is where I talk about having the two screens, because they may need to keep it up for the captioning, or they need to keep it up for the interpreter, or both. But they may need another screen so that they can access pulling something up on an online platform, such as in their Google Classroom. And so those things are super important to remember. And then just simple things that our kids usually pick up on. And as teachers of the deaf, if you're working on functional skills, the R here with respect is a great thing to start thinking about. And a teacher of the deaf may want to tweak or add, if appropriate, if there's an assessment that you can complete, which I have a couple that I would recommend for online learning. And this would be helpful just to say, hey, we don't do all caps. We don't, when we have to help each other during group assignments, there's going to be a lot of chit chat going back and forth. Or if we have to set up a meeting room, we need to make sure that the interpreter is invited and that my peers know how to use turn taking so that we can use the real-time captioning. Those are all they sound very simple. They sound great to all of us, but those are not simple in real time unless you practice it. This other one that says live video tips, here's why I love this one, is because it has a lot of visuals, and you may not notice it right away, but you might, depending on how you observe things. But you'll see here where it says minimize background noise, and it gives very specific examples, like the dog barking and the music notes and the fan running. And I know our audiologist probably is appreciating some of this, but that's really important. And again, good lighting, no lights behind you. Use a microphone or a headset. You can test some of these out. We have some examples that we've tried out, and you're certainly welcome to email me. It'll be at the end of the presentation. Using visuals, and if they're using visuals, they need to remember to show, then talk, or talk, then show. But these are just great fun ideas and simple ways to communicate with others about accessibility. All right, here's some tools for learning. So I wanted to just bring up some examples. At the bottom, you'll see this assignment tracker that is in Google under the Google Excel portion of the classroom. And it's blank when you get it. You can certainly make adjustments to it. And then on the left is ASL. This really goes back to the very important piece of how do I communicate with my child? Do I have the skills to do that? And how can we work to ensure understanding our sign form and the meaning that goes with those signs? So on the left here, you'll see that there's a bunch of different apps that you may want to consider. I will say that with the ASL stickers with Nile, I would say that's probably a little bit more for the older crowd, depending on what you're comfortable with. But there's all sorts of different options here, and even getting down to the Care Bears, and you can do that with 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. So I loved the options here, and there's not one that I recommend over another. You really just need to know yourself and your child in order to pick something that works for you. Again, as I mentioned before, photo math and extra math. Now, the last two that I didn't have a chance to mention, and I do want to highlight, is Flipgrid. Flipgrid is so cool. It is something that allows a teacher like myself or a general ed teacher to record a lesson, which means we can also make sure our captionings are accurate and also make sure that we have interpreting if we need it. And then what we do is we allow ourselves to record those lessons. And then when we send it from Flipgrid, it will allow students to respond in their own language, and they can create whatever the expectations are as far as the assignment is concerned. So it's really cool. And it also gives that time, and it also gives you that time to create accuracy with accessibility. Marco Polo, for those of you who might be already familiar with it, is also another way to ask and receive information in speech or ASL format. So you can say on a day maybe when you're giving an extra assignment, or if you want to remind them to complete an assignment, you can sign that to your student or the parent, and then you can get that information back from them if they want to respond and say, haha, I already did that assignment, I'm done, I can't wait to see you tomorrow. Or they can actually complete an assignment on Marco Polo where you basically give the instructions and then they have to put a response back to you. So these are all really cool tools for learning that might be helpful in a virtual environment. All right, this talks about building our container. And this is kind of what I talked about before, which is communication. How do we communicate? We might use multiple ways to communicate. And so it's important that we evaluate our communication skills and what we're good at. The second thing is, what's the plan? Who does what when, and why is this important? It's important because if we have constant check-ins with each other, then we know what's working and what's not, and why it worked in one situation and maybe it didn't work. For example, a plan that might have worked in math class did not work in science class. So that's super, super important. I would encourage teachers of the deaf and parents to what I call build their digital muscle. If children aren't used to where they find things on their desktop, or if you haven't organized that for them, or they don't know how to open one thing or another, that is going to be a huge challenge. If you practice and work on your technology and digital muscle, it gets them to independence, which means not as many parents have to be that close, or their learning partner has to be that close to help them with those things. Applying their reading and writing skills will be greater than ever. And again, that is why I really think that service time for teachers of the deaf and for interpreters and facilitators need to be heavily considered, obviously on a case-by-case basis, because none of us have the same child. And that's important to remember. A simple thing that I talked about earlier was creating a bank of chat questions, so that I think this is good for any kid, but it helps them, copy and paste instead of typing everything out, unless it's got to be, they're going to add to it and be more specific. But I do think that that saves them time and effort when they're trying to learn, because once they go to type it, they're missing whatever else is happening on the screen. And then, like I said, use patterns to maintain and guide your practice. If you guys say we always meet on Friday morning at 10 o'clock, stick to that. And if you find that things are getting smoother, then maybe you meet every other week at 10 o'clock on a Friday. But you have to have patterns that maintain and guide good practice to make sure that accessibility and content understanding and performance are happening. So I was really conflicted as to whether to share this slide or not, but I do think it's important because I feel like sometimes educators or other people talk about this and they think everybody knows what it means. So this is asynchronous versus synchronous learning. Asynchronous is not live. It's recorded and planned with, it could be planned with a syllabus. As an example, that could be like that flip grid that I talked about. And there's a syllabus that goes with every single lesson. So they know what they have to read, do, and produce. Synchronous means that it's live. It's happening in real time. That's the joy of what we're doing right now. We're doing a synchronous learning experience. And so that also could mean that we have real meets. For example, if we have teachers who host smaller groups, or maybe there's some facilitation time that's happening to help the child work through some of the language that's in their tasks, those would be synchronous. It's happening where we can give back and forth information, or I'm live and it's happening in real time. Another piece of this would be in person. And this, of course, I put this here with safety measures. Of course, each district is following CDC guidelines, but they might look a little different. And it might be 5 days a week. Then the blended is a mix of the three. They're going to be in person, they're going to have some live learning, and then they're going to have some asynchronous learning. So there's a huge high demand on what we're asking our students to do, our teachers to do. And for the audiologist that's with us, it also creates some challenges with equipment to make sure that our kids have and our parents have the knowledge of how to hook everything up and test it and make sure that they're listening online and that it's accessible. And then also for those of us that are teachers of the deaf, equipment, if they're in a blended environment, will have to travel back and forth from home to school, depending on what their expectations are. But I highly think that that's going to be the case. But again, that's an IEP team decision and individualized. And then I just gave some examples of what that might look like. A lot of our schools that are doing virtual teaching are asking our teachers to go into school and teach from their classrooms, which is why I have that empty classroom there. Blended learning might look like you're at school 6 feet apart with your own water bottle, and you've got equipment in front of you, like that one kid has an iPad, but the other one doesn't. And then they might be going home and doing something different. And then the last one is in-person, traditional with safety. And we have to understand that some of our students who are deaf and hard of hearing do have other disabilities, and some of those classrooms are going to look very different. And we need to make sure we're considering those, all of those students in those situations as well. All right, accommodations. COVID-19 class. I just thought that that was so funny, so I had to put up that visual. So here are some very simple accommodations to get you started. And of course, if you think of more, I would love for you to put it in the chat or on Facebook Live, write it down so that we can make sure that we are sharing this with others, because of course, you're only the smartest person in the room when you're there by yourself. So accommodations, additional time. If there are going to be lessons that are recorded and then we need to get them captioned, or we need to have interpreting added to those videos, it's going to take a little turnaround time, meaning that we're going to have to arrange for that to happen. It needs to be produced, and then that link has to be sent to the family, the student, the teacher. And once that's complete, the child needs to complete whatever the task is for that lesson and access what's next. So I do think additional time may be necessary for some of our students in a virtual environment. Special microphones, we talked about this earlier. There are some special microphones that help keep us loud and close and we're not turning away, or ways to make sure that our signal is clear coming across the digital platform. FM and DM use, we need to make sure that we're thinking about how that's going to happen. How does that get transported? Who's responsible? Do we need to do any parent training versus teacher training? A lot of times on the IEP, we have teacher training to say, this is how they access your classroom and this is their equipment, and or you're going to have an interpreter in your room and you need to provide closed caption videos. But in this particular environment, we may be asking our parents to be the one that makes sure that their equipment is working that day, and they might need some training as well. So please keep that in mind. Videos may need to be signed, not just closed captions. So please keep that in mind. Again, my big one is no talk and show at the same time. You'd be surprised how comfortable we are doing that, so we can progress in our teaching time, and we have to stop. It's very important. For those of them that are in hybrid situations, face mask versus shields are important. And is the face mask visible? If that's also important. So those are things to think about. Most districts, and just so you know, from the State Department, they have provided 5 masks, which are not with a clear view, and 1 shield per teacher if they are on roster. That's from the State Department. And so that certainly is something that's been pushed out and approved. But each district is also working on their safety measures, so it's important to have those discussions. Closed or open captioning, word banks. And then this last one, sometimes we do this in general, but it's something to think about. On the digital platform, there's a lot coming at you. There's a lot that you're paying attention to, and it's in 2D. And it's hard to pull out what's important because we don't have that emphasis or the facial expression, or sometimes teachers say, this is important, so you should highlight this. But for our kids, with the amount of information they're taking in on a 2D screen, targeted notes that help them focus their time and effort on vocabulary and concepts may be more important. That may be an accommodation that you need to consider. I'm sorry. Okay, online assessment. Oh, I'm seeing some questions here, so I apologize. Kara, I apologize that I didn't catch this. On the online assessment, there's some discussion, and I certainly would open it up to the audiologist to share with me, because there's been some conversation about like FLE and is that appropriate? And do our kids have the ability to hear and do things? Some of it is just a functional assessment. And I can't share it now, but I'm certainly comfortable to email that or give some ideas to that after the presentation. I'm not sure that they're all research and evidence-based, but they are something, and we need something. Okay, another question. When you touch on elementary school aged kids, my 6-year-old severely struggled to do virtual learning. I have no doubt. She completely shut down and the days were very long and defeating. She loves her DHH teacher and interpreter, but will only speak and interact to them in person. My worry is if they do virtual, it would make her suffer emotionally and regress. Do you see this with the same age children? And what advice can you offer? So I really appreciate that question, because the younger ones are the harder ones, right? Because we love to talk back and forth with them and share with them and play with them. I will share this, that there are some innovative ideas that some districts or some teachers might be okay with, but like there are some ways to create a positive attitude online, meaning if your student is online and she has to create something and the teacher's going to come and pick it up outside of your driveway, that could be a motivator to be on the computer. Some of the other things that we do at Carter Hears is we have something called a lending library. And so it's actually tangible items that our teachers use online and that she also, your daughter and you, would have in front of you. So when I pick up the little pig, you get to pick up the little pig, and then we have that interaction. As far as some other pieces for emotional and social learning, I don't address that very much on here, but I certainly have some supports for that. So definitely email me. It basically talks about perhaps sharing, like one other simple example for emotional and social learning is to have a stuffed animal or something about that, and making sure that you like talk to the stuffed animal or create something else with the stuffed animal, so they're not having to interact just with the screen. And then, but we can observe those interactions, or we can ask the animal to do those things. Those are just some quick ideas. Of course, I don't know your child specifically, but that would be something that I would recommend as something to think about. All right, I know that we're getting close to my time, so I am going to just try to get through the next couple screens because it is important. Service considerations, some of these things I've already shared, which was 2 devices, Google Meets or Zoom for additional support, one-on-one teaching and tutoring, mail touchable materials. I just talked about that. Thank you for the parent asking that question and leading me to that. Lessons are matched with the learning option. So a blended learning style should have a blended approach. Something that they do live and in person should also have a virtual component that matches what they learned. Not everything is brand new. Classroom assignments should be embedded where they're appropriate, which means the teacher of the deaf can support the classroom. Using that muscle, mastering and finding and working in classrooms, container building goals. I want y'all to have container building goals. All the other things that I talked about, I think, are really here for the service considerations. So here's our class recap. What are the 3 things we need? Think equality, think equity, not equality. That's a mistake there. So I caught myself, which means accessibility, tools, and building our container. How can we do this? Honesty and communication. This means asking for what you need, telling the truth about your experience. We can do this through accommodations and service considerations. And then what type of learning is this? Think, what am I signing up for? Asynchronous, synchronous, in person, blended. This is one of my favorite slides of all time. I also have a gift, but I didn't put it on here. Do not overthink. This is one of my very favorite things. So here's our problem. Our glasses fog up when we wear a mask, right? The world's most important pro tip: a piece of medical tape on top of your mask will keep your glasses from fogging up for literally hours. And so, as a reminder to all of you, answers can be simple. They don't have to be complicated to be a good answer. Be open to experimenting. That's the container building piece that I talked about. Be honest about what works and what doesn't, communicating with the team on a regular basis. And always be willing to ask yourself and ask your child to do this. This is such a healthy social emotional thing that can be altered depending on their age. But what do I hope to learn? I hope today I learned how well I can hear my teacher. I hope to learn that captioning can be done when everybody has their mics off, on mute. Those are really good questions to be patient with yourself and patient. The student can be patient and the teacher can be patient. I think everybody, general ed teacher, ourselves that are here watching this, we're all feeling a little bit we're filled with anxiety of the unknown. And so trying to not overthink and just live into the moment is super, super important. Thank you guys so very much. Comments, questions, and compliments. You always can reach out to me, Mariann Carter. That's my email address, my literal personal email address. So feel free to reach out to me. And I just want to say to all of you, my thoughts are with you. I'm definitely a champion for you and your children, and I'm happy to partner and support anyone. So please don't feel uncomfortable reaching out. And thank you again to all of those who sponsored today's event. I'm graciously thankful to be a part of it.